It was a frustrating season for Ryan Hartman in 2022-2023 after a career year last year. So how do we get Hartman back on track? What does he need to do in order to avoid this again next season? We discuss on today's episode of Locked on Wild.
You're Locked on Wild, your daily podcast on the Minnesota Wild. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's happening, everybody? Welcome to another episode of Locked on Wild, your daily Minnesota Wild podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Thanks for making Locked on Wild your first listen each and every day. Make sure you subscribe on YouTube so you don't miss out on any of our new episodes throughout the week. If this is your first time listening to the show, we welcome you in and hope that you stick around for future episodes. If you're one of the everydayers that tunes into Locked on Wild multiple times or every single day throughout the course of the week, we are glad to have you back. On today's episode of Locked on Wild, we evaluate the 2022-2023 season for Ryan Hartman, looking at the potential for him to maybe get dealt over the offseason and what needs to happen for Hartsey going into next year as well. My name is Seth Topol, your daily Minnesota Wild insider, and Hartman just did not hit that same level of production that he had last year. That's no surprise. We're not breaking any news here. But there just was so much that went into what was really just a roller coaster season for Ryan Hartman. You had him last year hit the career high in pretty much every offensive category, centering Kirill, Kaprizov, and Matt Zuccarello. That line got put together early and did not miss a beat. This year, Hartman got called for a ton of penalties all season, struggled to shoot the puck at times, got demoted off of the first line, got put back on the first line, and it just was a season that just was all over the place, to put it bluntly. Hartman finished the season with 15 goals, 22 assists, and 37 points in 59 games. So missed a chunk of time during the middle of the season, then obviously in the postseason, battled through injury as well. But no surprise then, with fewer games, we saw a dip in pretty much every offensive category throughout the course of the season. Hartman somehow managed to keep his penalty minutes right on par. In fact, his penalty minutes per game was actually up this season. Finished the year with 90 penalty minutes in 59 games compared to 95 in 82 games last year. Hartman finished the season with 4 power play points, also had a couple of shorthanded goals as well. Shot 10.1% from throughout the course of the year. That was down by 4% from last year. So he had 149 shots this year, shot 10.1%. Had 239 shots last year, shot 14.2%. His faceoff percentage also dropped to 42.9%. And most of the other metrics were right about on the same pace as he had last year. He blocked 48 shots. He had 62 hits, 30 takeaways, 32 giveaways. And so I think the biggest thing that it came down to for Hartman this season was just the number of penalties. And I know there are some, like, as we look through the ledger of the Ryan Hartman experience, he had a few games in which he had, the game misconduct, the match penalty. That was against the New Jersey Devils, for example. Had 17 penalty minutes in that game. Ended up not getting to the end of that game. But you look at some of the other months too, even factoring in some of those 10 minutes of penalty minutes nights, he still had a ton of penalties. Like, for instance, he went the entire month of October and had 3 games in which he was called for multiple penalties. In all of those games, he had 2 other games in which he was called for penalties too. Penalties were a problem for Ryan Hartman this season. And the physical stuff, I don't necessarily even like to count those, because a lot of times you're getting in a fight, and so at that point then you get the 5 and you maybe get the 10 tacked on. But it's just all the other penalties that happen throughout the course of the year, the stuff that is done to try to make up for getting beat to the puck, trying to prevent somebody from getting to the net. All those types of penalties are the ones that just cost this team throughout the course of the season. And we've talked about this with Kevin Gorg at points throughout the season. And Ryan Hartman is a guy who plays kind of right on the razor's edge in terms of being too aggressive and to being able to use that aggressiveness to his advantage. Case in point, the game against the St. Louis Blues this year, in which Hartman scored and just got tangled up with Jordan Binnington after scoring a goal, which led to just a huge melee between the two teams. That's an instance in which Hartman, teetered on that line, but didn't quite go over. But then you have all the other examples this year of just doing too much and really showing a lot of frustration with his lack of scoring. Had just a terrible start to the season in which he had 1 goal and 4 assists in October and shot just 4.8%. Just had the 1 goal on 21 shots. Now, steadily started to increase some of that. He missed the entire month of November and half of December, but then had 3 goals in the remaining 6 games in December. Shot 20% in the month of December. But then you go to January, 1 goal and 4 assists on 30 shots. Just a 3.3% shot percentage. In February, had 4 goals, shooting percentage back up. Followed that up with a solid month of March in which he had 5 goals, 7 assists, and 12 points through the month of March. But then again in the month of April, had 1 goal and 2 assists, 3 total points in the 6 games there. Had the unbelievable game-winning goal in Game 1 of the series against the Stars, then scored and had 2 assists in Game 3. Did not play in Game 2, and then had 1 combined point in Games 4, 5, and 6. So Hartman as well, like a lot of the other players on this team, not able to get it done in the postseason, albeit from what we're told, a pretty substantial leg injury that he was battling through. And so props for that, but at the same time, just with a lot of the guys, if you're going to be a detriment out there, then as hard as it is, if you're so hurt to the point that you're not able to be effective, then what are we doing? So very much an up and down season for Ryan Hartman here for the Minnesota Wild. Before we end the show today, we'll hand out letter grades for his performance in key areas. And we'll also look ahead as to what is in store for Hartman for the rest of his contract for next season as well. All of that coming up on today's episode of Locked On Wild after this. Attention active individuals. Are you tired of sacrificing comfort for style when it comes to your activewear? Introducing Bird Dogs, the game changer in athletic shorts. With their unique built-in liner, these shorts offer ultimate support and flexibility, ensuring you stay comfortable during even the most intense workouts. And here's the best part. Bird Dogs are more than just workout gear. They're versatile enough to take you from the gym to the street without skipping a beat. Designed with pockets that actually work, Bird Dogs gives you ample space to store your essentials while you're on the move. And guess what? No more chafing or discomfort. Bird dogs are made with premium breathable fabric that keeps you cool and dry throughout your activities. Whether you're hitting the trail, crushing it at the gym, or simply lounging around the house, bird dogs are the shorts you've been searching for. It's like wearing a hug. Don't settle for ordinary shorts. Upgrade to bird dogs and experience a whole new level of performance and comfort. Best of all, when you head to birddogs.com/lockedonnhl and you enter promo code LOCKEDONNHL, they'll throw in a free custom Bird Dogs Yeti-style tumbler with every order. Continuing today's episode of Locked On Wild, once again, thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Everydayers coming up tomorrow. We will talk Jared Spurgeon and also Jake Middleton for their season evals as we keep those going here throughout the rest of the offseason. So plenty of interesting discussion on the Jared Spurgeon front in particular on tomorrow's episode. Let's go to letter grades for Ryan Hartman for his performance this season in terms of offense. And we're talking strictly 5-on-5 here because we have special teams in a separate category: offense, defense, special teams, postseason, and total letter grade as well. Offensively for Hartman, it was a journey, and so I'm going to go, we went B- for Matt Zuccarello for his offensive performance this season. I'm going to go with a C for Hartman, just super up and down, and it seemed like for every instance in which there was some progress made, some positive steps put forward to try to kind of get back on track. Then you had the penalties, you had getting pushed down lower in the lineup. We did see signs of return when Hartman was moved back up to the top line, but it took a while for that point to come as we moved throughout the season. So going with the C for offense. Now defensively, Hartman is, of the three on that top line, he is the one that has a little bit more ability to be physical and to show some defense out there, those puck battles along the boards, in the corners. That being said, again, penalties. And so going to go C+ in that aspect for Hartman. In terms of the postseason, props for playing, but you got to find a way to you have to find a way to help make an impact. Outside of those two games, there was really nothing. And so we're going to go for Hartman because I know the extent of the injury was pretty bad. So we're going to go with, for the playoffs, we'll go a C- there. And then special teams, that special teams unit, particularly that second power play unit, was disastrous at points throughout the season. I know it's not necessarily on any of the particular players on that unit. It just speaks to a larger issue with this Wild team, that they didn't really have enough skill players to spread to make it so that they had two equally capable or even semi-capable power play units. And so they went with the stack approach and just stacked power play one as much as possible to try to, well, hey, we're going to get a couple of cracks at this with our top unit. If we don't score with them, we're probably not scoring anyway. And so special teams wise, I'm going to give a C- for Hartman as well. Just it's tough without a player to drive that unit on that second power play unit. So that one was mostly a mess. And on the penalty kill as well, I think I'll actually probably knock it down even slightly more, because with Joel Eriksson Ek out of the lineup, you're seeing guys like Hartman and Freddie Gaudreau as that top line in the postseason on the penalty kill, and it didn't work. So I'm going to go D on special teams for Hartman, which leads to an overall grade on the season. I think I'm going C- for Hartman for his overall body of work for what we saw this season. There were a couple of moments. He did have a pretty solid month of January. But beyond that, just a ton of penalties, demotion, just not able to replicate what we saw in 2021, 2022. Whether or not that was a surprise is one thing, but just not able to capture that form. And it's interesting because if you look at Hartman's career stats as a member of the Minnesota Wild, he actually checked in at what would be considered an average season for him from a goals perspective. Has I think it's 65 goals in 4 games or 4 seasons for this Minnesota Wild team, and so he is about a 15 goal per year guy, which is what he got this year. It's just like with Matt Zuccarello, is you're getting those point totals. It just feels like it takes so much to get there, and it's just a lot of really aggressive up and down. So C- for Hartman for his 2022-2023 season. Now, contract-wise, where is Hartman at? Is there a possibility that he gets traded this offseason? What does he need to do in order to get back on track coming into next year? We'll talk about all that to finish today's episode of Locked On Wild after a word from our sponsors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is the right fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to eBay Motors. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Final segment of today's episode of Locked On Wild, your team every day. Thank you for making Locked On Wild your first listen each and every day. Again, for the everydayers, we've got Jared Spurgeon and Jake Middleton's season evaluations for you coming up tomorrow. There's a lot to talk about on the Jared Spurgeon front, and so we'll get into all of it on tomorrow's episode of Locked On Wild. So Hartman's contract, it's interesting because Hartman signed that super team-friendly deal, $1.7 million for, at the time, a 3-year extension, $1.7 million per season. So he's locked in through the end of the 2023-2024 season at $1.7 million per season. Because of that, I think that's why it is unlikely that Hartman ends up getting traded unless somebody overpays Bill Guerin to grab a veteran player to throw into their mix on a playoff team. That contract is just so team friendly, and you don't have at this point. We talked about the center position depth in general for the everydayers. That was, I believe, last week that we discussed that. You don't have a ton in the way of center depth on this team. You've got Hartman, Eriksson Ek, Gaudreau. You don't have, depending on Connor Dewar or Mason Shaw, who ends up being the center on that team. Shaw obviously out for likely the entire season. So I would imagine that Dewar slots in as the center on that line. The one guy that you have that is knocking on the door for one of those opportunities is Marco Rossi. So potentially, if Rossi plays well enough to supplant Ryan Hartman further down in the lineup, then maybe you can make a case that his spot is expendable. But until some center prospects down in the system start to really make some noise to where you would look at moving some of those guys out, I just don't think that top 3 is really moving unless somebody like with Hartman this past season, unless they just underperform to the level that they have to be moved off that line. Joel Eriksson Ek is going to return, and he will take his spot as likely that second line center. You've got Freddie Gaudreau locked in, who is your third line center. So there aren't really a lot of spots. There aren't really a lot of options to fill spots beyond what you currently have. And so I think Hartman gets the opportunity to try to rebound after a disappointing, not a failure, disappointing but not a failure season this past year. So how does Hartman get back to what we saw in 2021, 2022? Well, it comes from, number one, stop taking penalties. The frustration, I'm sure, from just not getting off to the great start, because that was the other thing about it too with Hartman last season, is that not only did he have a ton of goals throughout the year, he got off to an insane start. He had, I think, 15 goals in the first 20 games of the season, 22 games of the season. It's going to be hard to replicate that no matter who you are. There may be one or two players in the NHL, Austin Matthews, Connor McDavid. There probably are the only two guys, or one of the only few, that can put together that type of a stretch from a goal scoring perspective. So it was always going to be a tough order for Hartman to replicate that. But having like 2 goals in that same span, yeah, that's going to be frustrating. And not only that, but just the propensity for this team to be called for penalties, the offense not clicking as much as it did last year, leading to players trying to press way too much to try to prevent goals, try to make things happen. So you have to limit the amount of penalties. And this is where the accountability factor comes into play. So we had it happen where Hartman got benched because of a few games in which he just was taking multiple penalties a night. But it didn't happen until like way late into the season. And it happened one time. The penalties still happened. And so are you really going to have a coach in Dean Evison who suddenly starts holding vets accountable for mistakes that they make that end up impacting and costing the team games? It's hard to just expect that a coach is going to suddenly flip the switch. I don't think that's going to be I don't think that's going to be something that just all of a sudden happens where if Hartman gets called for 2 penalties in a game, he just doesn't play the next game. It took a long time for even that step to have kind of gotten the point home. So it's going to be on Ryan Hartman himself to be more disciplined with his play on the ice. And that trio of Kaprizov, of Zuccarello, and Hartman, it's on them as well to be attacking when they're on the ice. A lot of passing between Kaprizov and Zuccarello, as we've talked about this week, if you listen to this show on an everyday basis. So for Hartman, that killer instinct mentality, that aggressive, be the aggressor type mentality, and just trying to limit the amount of times you head to the box. And it's not even for the fighting. Like, again, I will say as a host, I tend to throw fights away when you're talking about penalties, because a lot of times those are impacted by situations that happen during a game, whether it be retaliation or just finally letting some frustration boil over. So I'm not even talking about the fights. It's the other penalties, the tripping, the slashing, the hooking, the hold. Every penalty that there is out there. Ryan Hartman needs to be more disciplined in how he plays, and his play style tends to be more physical. You can be physical, just don't go overboard. Or if you get beat, don't try to overcompensate to make up for it. If you get beat on an angle to a puck, don't throw your stick out there to try to hold a guy back. Stuff like that. Just be a smarter player out there is, I think, the best way to replicate what happened this past season. And I think, too, a lot of guys on this team are going to be eager to try to show that this year was a fluke as opposed to last year. So a disappointing year for Hartman, to say the least, and a big question for him going into this coming season is, which one do we see? Which Ryan Hartman do we see? The 2022-2021, the 2022-2023, or likely somewhere in between? Maybe a better version of this year's, maybe a little bit lesser of last year's. That's again all on Hartman to figure out and to see which area he slots into. That will do it for today's episode of Locked On Wild. So thank you to everyone for tuning in once again. If this is your first time listening to the show, we're glad to have you along. And make sure that you subscribe on YouTube and your favorite podcast platforms so you don't miss out on future episodes and you can stay up to date with all things Minnesota Wild throughout the rest of the offseason. For the everydayers, thank you as always for your support. We'll catch you again for tomorrow's episode. Whichever category you land in, make sure you take the time to subscribe on YouTube, on your favorite podcast platforms, and follow us on social media as well. You can now listen to us on Amazon Music and Sirius XM. So make sure you follow along with new episodes every Monday through Friday as part of the Locked On Podcast Network.